Hello lovely people, my name is Emma. Welcome back to my channel. Welcome if you are new. Today I'm basically just going to ramble a little bit about a topic that I find really interesting. Today I want to talk about the recent changing image of Paul and Morgan. Paul and Morgan, if you're not familiar, are very evangelical Christians. They are sort of notorious online for their views, the things they've said about women, about the queer community, things like that. They come up a lot on channels like mine. Recently, it seems like things have started to change. I'm going to talk about some of the recent things that have happened. I'm going to talk about their interview with Jesse Lee Peterson a little bit, and then I'm going to focus on the Paul and Morgan, Jaclyn and David crossover universe. And I'm going to kind of go through my feelings and reactions. I've changed how I feel so many times through discussing this. I really think it's so interesting. I've definitely landed on overall, I feel very optimistic and positive about recent developments with Paul and Morgan's channel. I hope to also be able to explain why maybe some of Jaclyn's fans didn't have a very positive immediate reaction to them working with Paul and Morgan. I feel basically very middle ground about the whole thing, but I do feel a lot more positive overall about it than I did originally. I just want to say as well, I feel personally that everybody I'm going to talk about in this video, apart from Jesse Lee Peterson, he's a flying mention, everybody I'm going to mainly talk about in this video is trying their best and always improving. Therefore, I really don't advocate any kind of hate. If you're going to go and spread anything to any of these channels, however you feel, please only spread love. You can be angry at me if you want. I love hearing different opinions. If you think I'm totally crazy, if you agree with some of what I say, please give your feedback. I really love reading it. Like I said, it really changes my opinion a lot when I read the comments and when I talk to different people about things like this. But be nice to each other. So let's get into it. So a little while ago, Paul and Morgan did an interview that kind of turned into a debate with Jesse Lee Peterson. We know Jesse, we've talked about Jesse. Beta! Let's just say it's kind of weird and interesting that they did this interview at all. Judging by their reactions, especially Morgan's reaction afterwards, because Jesse is sexist, doesn't even begin to cover it. But I can only imagine how it feels just talking to him as a woman. I don't know if they maybe didn't do quite enough research, they didn't realise quite how extreme his views are. It's a pretty standard Jesse Lee Peterson interview. He asks over and over again if Morgan obeys Paul. Paul does a pretty good job of defending his wife, which you would kind of expect or hope any husband would do. Paul and Morgan got a lot of positivity for this interview. I think my favourite kind of reaction to it was Jimmy Snow's, because he had the same sort of feeling as I think a lot of people did, which is, wow, go Paul and Morgan for shutting down some of Jesse Lee Peterson's radical views, but also being critical where it was fair of Paul really giving Jesse Lee Peterson more of the benefit of the doubt than he kind of deserves, and feeding him some things that he wanted to hear. I felt that was quite a balanced reaction. So if you are interested and you haven't seen it, I'd recommend Jimmy Snow's video on it. I feel like Jesse Lee Peterson sets the bar really low. On the one hand, I do think that Paul and Morgan really benefited from this interview without really having to work for it. Because Paul and Morgan are suffering the mad questions of Jesse Lee Peterson, we naturally feel sorry for them. And when it becomes basically a debate between the two sides, when it comes to Jesse Lee Peterson, of course we're rooting for Paul and Morgan. They do the sort of the bare minimum, like considering women actual people rather than cattle and saying that racism exists. And so people are really supporting them. And I understand the reason for supporting them here. It's essentially like a debate with a supervillain. So whoever the other person is who you're rooting for, right? However, it is much easier to throw your opponent under the bus when what they say is mad. Jesse Lee Peterson tries and fails to cite the Bible properly, and sometimes he admits that he doesn't really read it. He repeats himself over and over again and doesn't really produce any reasoning for why he thinks things. It's very easy for Paul and Morgan to be like, well, clearly we don't agree with this person because he's mad. Everything he says is mad. If they were to do an interview with somebody like God is Grey, please, we would love to see it, we would love to see it. It would be a very different discussion, because their opponent wouldn't just be a renowned idiot, they would have to actually address and square their religious differences, which I think would be really beneficial and really interesting. That's my sort of cynical take. On the positive side, I do genuinely think that this interview has had an impact on them, especially Morgan. From the later videos on their channel and Jaclyn Glenn's channel, it does really seem like this had an effect on them. And I think that seeing the sort of logical conclusion of that kind of extremism in the form of Jesse Lee Peterson is probably kind of a wake-up call in many ways. So there's also a video fairly recently on Paul and Morgan's channel that I think is honestly brilliant. It's the only video of Paul and Morgan's that I've ever enjoyed. Obviously, I share very different views to Paul and Morgan on the majority of the content they make, but their video on leaving the Charismatic church is really, really good. They are really considerate of viewers from other churches. They acknowledge that no church is perfect. The best and most hopeful thing for me is that they are open and honest about having wholeheartedly believed different prophets and prophecies that come from that church without questioning them. They talk about the benefits of stepping back and examining their faith and not just going along with what preachers say. I also really like Paul's jumper. Morgan says about they were in a place where they didn't feel like they needed to ask questions. Yes. So honest, such a relatable experience for so many. They talk about holding pastors accountable to their preachings. It sounds like a lot of things have happened recently, as has been the case for a lot of us, where Morgan's had certain health journeys and family members who have suffered with COVID. And those things, I think, have definitely influenced their beliefs in many ways, which seems to be having a really positive impact. I'm not going to go too much into that because it's personal stuff, but it seems like those things had a really heavy impact, and a lot of their viewers seem very grateful to be able to share in that with them, especially if they've had similar experiences, so I think that was really nice too. It just honestly is a really honest video. It's one of the most honest things I've seen recently. When you get into, I can't think of another way to say culty, when you get into a kind of culty group mindset, it is very hard to see when you are just going along with everything and not asking questions. And the fact that they've seen that, they've acknowledged that, and now they're examining their faith and trying to work out which church is best for them and what their personal convictions are. Paul talks a lot about going back to the word, which I think, obviously I don't agree with the word in a lot of places, but going back to your personal convictions instead of just blindly believing every preacher, I just think it's really, really good. I think it's a hugely positive step in the right direction, and the fact that they were completely honest about how they had just been essentially blindly following for a while without questioning, and that has changed, I just think that's so, so good. I'm really excited about that part of their journey, honestly. I obviously don't agree with their views on basically anything that their channel talks about, but it's not for me. As Christians from a more kind of extreme and conservative perspective, that is who they appeal to. So I think Paul and Morgan using their influence over that audience to share their journey in becoming less extreme and openly questioning their church and just saying you don't have to believe everything, I think that's extremely powerful. I think that's a really, really positive way to use their platform, and it could do a lot of people a lot of good if that kind of trend continues. So then we get to this Jaclyn and David, Paul and Morgan crossover universe. On Paul and Morgan's channel, they did a marriage Q&A, an atheist versus Christian marriage Q&A. A fun idea in general. I do think it's an easier topic for them to deal with, for Paul and Morgan to deal with, as two cis hetero couples. They can find a lot of common ground there without too many obstacles. The crossover videos kind of skirted around the bigotry that Paul and Morgan have displayed in the past. If we're being honest about their content, they have bigoted views. So here's one thing that some people had kind of a knee-jerk reaction to when the photos of Jaclyn's family and Paul and Morgan came out, because Paul and Morgan have spread a lot of anti-vax misinformation and anti-mask stuff during the COVID lockdown in fairly recent history. So a lot of people had a kind of knee-jerk reaction to Jaclyn and David and their baby hanging out with essentially known anti-vaxxers. I'm pretty certain that they would have done COVID tests and made sure everything was safe. I think because they live in different states, they probably would have had to. I do think and understand that doing overly positive videos during the pandemic with kind of anti-vax, anti-mask people, I can understand why that would have a negative reaction. Based on what Morgan says about her father having been hospitalized with COVID, I get the impression that their feelings on those topics are changing and evolving, and they might not have changed enough to address them yet, or they might still be working things out, or it might just be personal. But I acknowledge that their public image, i.e. the information that they have shared publicly, is anti-vax misinformation. That for me felt like something that it would have just been nice to address. in one of their videos, if they had just, maybe they did and I missed it somewhere, but I think it would have been useful and helpful for the audience and beneficial to kind of address that. And then we come to their previous beliefs on, well, everything. Queer people, abortions, the whole shebang. For me, it kind of felt like an elephant in the room, like a glaringly obvious set of things that we're not talking about, we're pretending aren't a thing. And I don't think anyone meant any harm. I think everybody, like Paul and Morgan and Jaclyn and David, all had good intentions. And one thing that I want to highlight that Paul said in, I believe, the video on Jaclyn's channel, he talked about how having the four of them having a friendship does encourage and bring up more challenging conversations, which leads me to believe that they have been having these kind of discussions, just probably they're not in a position where they're ready to have those discussions in front of the camera. I think that we should be optimistic and assume the best of everybody reevaluating how they feel. So here's the thing. So initially, this kind of made me uncomfortable. Honestly, just being a member of the queer community, this is why I initially felt pretty uncomfortable seeing the four of these people just in a photo together. As somebody who likes Jaclyn's content, and I think a few other people felt the same way, just judging by what I saw online. When you've always positioned yourself as an ally, aligning with someone who has a long history, and a recent history as well, of homophobia, anti-feminism, spreading medical myths, not just about COVID, but birth control, abortion, mental health. Paul and Morgan have shared an enormous amount of unhealthy advice, misinformation, and there's nowhere that they've corrected those things. There's nowhere that they suggest that their views on really important things like LGBTQ+ issues have changed. If they have, I'd really love to hear it. Otherwise, I have to kind of assume that Paul and Morgan still hold the same beliefs that their channel espouses. So for a lot of people, I think seeing somebody who is meant to be an ally dismiss that homophobic and unhealthy content as differences, we can all get along aside from our differences, can be quite hurtful. I think a lot of people felt like it minimizes the issue and the harm that Paul and Morgan have done, because we have to acknowledge that too. They've done a lot of harm with their platform. They've made a lot of extreme hurtful views and homophobic views, among other things, acceptable to a big audience. And we can't just pretend that didn't happen. The thing about privilege is that you don't realize that you have it, right? It's much easier to hang out with somebody who is, say, homophobic if you're not gay, because they're not going to question your sexuality. It's not going to be a thing. Your queer friends and your queer followers might be a bit upset. I guess what I'm trying to say or trying to ask is to be compassionate of that. There's been much, much, much positivity on Jaclyn's channel, on Paul and Morgan's channel, on their social medias, so much positivity. But people who have kind of questioned that and said, I don't feel comfortable with this because of Paul and Morgan's homophobic comments, and I'm disappointed. They've gotten quite an angry reaction from some of the positive fans, which is sort of there's a weird kind of flip-flop there. I'm just trying to explain why, as a queer person, or somebody who supports or requires access to abortion, who's struggled with their mental health, etc., anyone who's suffered from that kind of content, try and be considerate of where they're coming from. Because that was how I honestly felt initially. So here's my kind of flip side that I have since landed on. Firstly, I don't think we should ever be policing friendships. It happens online quite a lot that people are condemned for things that their friends or family or associates have done. You know, you liked a tweet from this person that I don't think we should be. I think it's very close-minded to condemn people for what others have done. I think that Paul and Morgan, and people like them, making friends with more liberal people, liberal with a small L for you Americans, I think that can only be a good thing, and vice versa. Opening up your friendship group to include more wider opinions can only make you more understanding. And here's the main thing. The road from extremism, it's a very gentle climb out. If one day it's re-examining their faith in the charismatic church and the church leaders there, and the next day it's being able to sit down and have fun conversations with an atheist couple, I think they are on the correct path away from extremism. It really, really seems like that to me. The optimist in me thinks that this could be a brilliant path forward, and thinks that this will be a good path forward for Paul and Morgan to be swayed out of some of those bigoted beliefs and some of the conspiracies they lean into. The pessimist in me worries a little bit that by reforming Paul and Morgan and giving them so much praise, without those beliefs having outwardly changed. It almost minimizes the damage that they've done with some of their past content. I guess what I want, and what I kind of expect to happen, if Paul and Morgan continue to make content that is very upsetting, that is bigoted, that they now will have access to more different views that they might hold in higher regard. That if their friends, people like Jaclyn and David, are willing to have those conversations with them and be critical of them, which I think that they will, then Paul and Morgan are more likely to change their views and subsequently change the impact that they'll have on their community. I really do think that their video on leaving the Charismatic Pentecostal church, I think it is really, really good. And seeing them being open and willing to question things just really makes me believe that they're onto a better path. I do think that there is an issue and an element of disappointment in minimizing the things that Paul and Morgan have said and done as differences. The thing that I respect the most about both Paul and Morgan's channel and Jaclyn's channel is that throughout their history they have demonstrated that they are willing to be open about their opinion having changed, whether that's a little bit or dramatically. And that's something I think is brilliant about their channels. When it comes down to questions of equal rights for same-sex couples, personally, I don't feel there's a middle ground. Most people don't feel there's a middle ground. The people who consider there to be a middle ground probably wouldn't ever be affected by it and are extending a little bit of privilege there. That's the part that makes the conversation quite difficult. In short, I'm optimistic. I hope that while audiences have found a lot of newfound respect for Paul and Morgan, and I'm glad that people are excited about this kind of crossover of differing opinions, them being able to hang out with atheists and have these conversations, I hope that we can maintain that optimism and be proud of Paul and Morgan for the changes they're making, whilst still being critical of them for some of the views they hold. This is the thing, it doesn't have to be this person is evil and we hate them. We can say, I really like this thing that they did in Micah. I really liked their video. I really like that video they did on leaving their church. I think it's really impactful and helpful. But if they come out and say something really controversial that I disagree with, I'm still going to be critical of that. And that basically, I think that shouldn't affect our ability to have those conversations. And I do honestly think that the best way forward is to forge these kind of friendships like these four people have. I feel like this has been a little bit of a rambly stream of consciousness because there's just so much going on here. I genuinely think overall this is the best path for Paul and Morgan away from extremism. I think they saw the face of extremism in Jesse Lee Peterson and they've gone, whoa now, and they're stepping back and re-examining their beliefs. And they're now a lot more open to questioning their faith. I do think some of these videos are really worth watching. I think their video on no longer being hyper-charismatic is really good. I think the video, I think it's called like Paul and Morgan and My Friends Now, something like that, on Jaclyn Glenn's channel is really good. The Jesse Lee Peterson, like I said, I recommend Jimmy Snow's reaction to that. It's all super interesting. I definitely couldn't consider myself a supporter of Paul and Morgan until some of their views could change openly. I can't pretend that they don't espouse homophobia, anti-abortion, anti-feminism. And those things are all very crucial to my life, my existence. But I think we're on the right track, and I'm definitely happy to keep an eye on where they're going and see what kind of things they talk about next. And just seeing how those views change, seeing how they acknowledge the things they've talked about in the past. I hope that there could be more crossover with atheist creators, with less fundamentalist Christian creators, where they can actually examine those beliefs and those statements that they have made that are so hurtful to certain communities. I really, really hope that's where we go. Time will tell. Do let me know your thoughts down below. If you're a fan of Jaclyn or you're a fan of Paul and Morgan, how did you first react to seeing them together? Has your opinion changed? Have you been flip-flopping and thinking loads of different things like me? I really, really want to hear your comments. Not just because it feeds the YouTube algorithm, well it does, but also because engaging in these discussions is what changes my mind and opens me up to listening to new perspectives. I think this could be a really positive thing. I think this could set a really good precedent with opening up conversations with people who have very different views. I just would like to praise the attitudes of all the people involved. Again, apart from Jesse Lee Peterson. That man will never change. But in terms of Paul and Morgan and Jaclyn and David, it only works because they are all open to having those conversations in good faith. Those discussions don't work if the people involved aren't genuine. I think that speaks to the people involved. Let me know your thoughts down below. This was a little bit of a rambly one, but I just have found it so interesting. I really wanted to talk about it. I want to get some conversation going. Thank you so much for watching. Do give this video a cheeky little like if you enjoyed it. Do subscribe if you haven't already, and there's more fun stuff. Before we go, I would like to give a huge shout out to my giant chickens over on Patreon: Abigail Hess, Amalgam of Neuroses, Amber, Chris Simpson, Connie Wright, Conla, Chicken, Maximus Lyons, goddammit Conla, Curious Capybara, Danny, Faye Gregory, Fulcrum, Gaming Ridge, Henry Curtis, Izzy, Joe Rowe, Keith from Anonymous, Lizzie Gale, Lynn Dobbs, Miles Tagg, Morgaringa, Mr. Creosote, Nick Hook, Ninja Red, Simping on Emma Thorne, Seriously, Taxman, Tracy O'Rourke, and Wasatch Witch. Thank you so much, you guys are amazing, really appreciate all your support. Thank you so much for watching, and have a very lovely week!